So we'll try to understand if well-being improves society. And we are especially concerned about challenges in measuring progress, also development theories, because we think that it's important to make a dialogue between development, sociology of development, and the science and well-being. And we also are very concerned with what are more or less successful societies. Perhaps it's collaborandia that Stefano mentioned. Let's see. So our agenda, it has these 6 points, but I will be very quick, I hope. First, an introduction with some questions. Then this dialogue that we think it's important between the sociology of development and the science of well-being. Then it's important to have some discussion about these relations between objective and subjective indicators of well-being. And of course, here we need to talk about European micro databases. And in the point 5, we will present some data that are mainly focused on the relation between well-being and inequalities, and another point that I will talk later, and finally the conclusions. So, what are our questions? How the new sociology of development is incorporating the science of well-being? I think there are some theoretical aspects that needs to be discussed. Then what builds successful societies? The first question is, how are perceptions of well-being linked with those successful societies, or more or less successful society? And then these relations between micro and macro, micro and macro relations, and how the subjective and objective conditions are important for the progress of societies. About this theoretical discussion that we think it's important between the sociology of development and the science of well-being. They have, in our opinion, to deal with 6 main scientific and policy problems that we consider they are very pressing for today. Growth alternatives, growing inequalities, sustainable environments, the digital society, artificial intelligence and the future of work, and more advanced democracies. We are not presenting data for these problems, but we think that we could envision this relation between sociology of development and the science of well-being in dealing with these main problems of today. About working? Okay, sorry. We could the theories, the sociological theories of development could be organized in 4 blocks. First, the classic sociology, and then we have here the classics, Weber, Marx, and Durkheim, and the subjects were the modernity, differentiation and individualization, capitalism, rationalization and commodification. Then we have the modernization theories, and we think these were the most important topics about the role of elites in modernizing countries and the institutionalization of change. Then the dependency theories and the relation between center and periphery between countries, and how these relations are unequal and how they could provoke dependent development. But the most important for us and the dialogue with the science of well-being will be here in the sociology, the new sociology of development that has the main purpose of giving importance to institutions, and has the broad perspective of globalization. That's the main 2 topics that we think are important. So, but they have separate ways, the sociology of development and the science of well-being, but they have already several common grounds. In terms of separate ways, in the sociology of development, we have these main concerns: dimension and regulation of globalization, social movements and international organizations, and war and international relations. But they share already a common ground: the concerns about poverty and inequalities, gender, education, capabilities, institutions, human development policies, environment and sustainable development. Some methodological questions, and our main concern is about how subjective and objective conditions could build more or less successful societies. We will have three aspects that are important for a methodological discussion about comparing several databases of European coverage, the need to discuss the system of indicators to measure well-being in European countries and region, because we think it's important to have a multi-scaling analysis about for understanding well-being in terms of transnational, national, subnational, and local. And we will show you some examples of the interdependencies between perception of well-being and relations with, mostly with inequalities, some data. These are the main micro databases that we could look, that are not the only one, but that we could look to understand better these relations between objective and subjective indicators: Eurobarometer, Eurostat, EUSILC, European Social Survey, and European Quality of Life Survey. There have been some ad hoc models for well-being, some specific ad hoc models about dimensions of well-being. And we see that sometimes there are some confusion about what is objective indicators, what are subjective indicators, and sometimes we think that having this discussion between subjective and objective indicators, we could go forward in the several dimensions of well-being that are normalized in several international organizations. So here we have the dimensions of Eurostat, OECD, several dimensions of well-being. Again, these questions, this is only an example. The air quality may not be adequate, but if citizens do not perceive in that way, they will not take action, or on a situation they do not perceive in such a negative way. So we would like to stress the importance of this for understanding in several dimensions of well-being, these relations between objective and subjective indicators. The question that I've mentioned about the several levels of analysis at country, region, or local level, and there are some lack of data, especially at the municipality level. And now I will show you some data that tries to understand how can we interlink objective and subjective indicators. Mainly about, in terms of inequalities, several indicators of inequalities. We could have a transnational perspective of inequalities, and also to have a way to think about clusters of configurations of inequalities. So here we have some objective indicators of inequalities: social class, education, gender, income, and we found some regularities in this transnational space. This is an analysis having in mind all the European citizens and using the European Social Survey. We could also have try to understand in these inequality configurations where countries fit in these inequality configurations. So that could be a way to understand these objective and subjective relations. These are the indicators of well-being. They are subjective indicators. Of course, they are relevant for going forward. These are analyses that tries to understand and to have your well-being profiles of European countries. Could have to understand well-being profiles in terms of subjective well-being, and we find out that there is some regularities between countries. We found 5 clusters of countries in terms of these subjective dimensions of well-being. Have show you here, but before that, the way that countries are are organized. The clusters function shows certain similarities that I will show later. Here is the way to understand subjective well-being, not subjective, a measure of well-being, and looking to objective conditions, social class and gender. And we have here the profiles of well-being, the clusters of well-being that we have discovered, and they are very geographical in terms of European distribution. And we see that mostly of the time in these well-being profiles, we have differences of well-being in terms of gender and social class. Here we have social class, gender, and we find some difference. So here we found these relations between the way that social class and gender could influence well-being. Here the same thing in each cluster of European clusters of well-being, the same, and we see significant relations. We could also have relations between subjective indicators of well-being. We could have more simple or more complex or more composite indicators of well-being, and this could also be a way to go further in understanding well-being. And now, focusing on subjective well-being, we saw some relations that we think are relevant between some types of objective indicators, mainly here in the case of income, but also years of schooling. Sorry. Here is a way to understand subjective well-being, looking to inside countries in terms of the distribution in terms of the class distribution, and we see a difference of subjective well-being between countries, but also inside countries, and the difference that the different social class have in terms of subjective well-being. Here we have the distribution of class in the European countries, and the way that we could understand that the class objective condition could also point to some relations for understanding subjective well-being. Here, and now I think another level that we think it's important to understand successful societies about the meso level and the collective action concept that was previously mentioned. Here we have the relations between trust in institution and progressivity of labor policy in Europe. And we have some relation that we could see between these two concepts. The meso level, okay, I will finish at time. The meso level for us is very important, and we should not think about macro and the macro relations in terms of understanding successful societies, but the meso level. In the meso level, we could have several indicators of collective action. Here we have an indicator that mostly shows the way that people have citizenship practice. And here we found also some relations between trust and collective action. Also some relations at comparing countries between human development and practice of collective action. Here, the relation between income and collective action, there are some regularities also. And also between training resources in a professional context and the collective action practice. Again, some correlations. And to conclude, so, well, my well-being improves societies, yes, but it's not enough if we stay in an individualistic box. We need to go further and not stay only on an individual perspective. More or less, we are observing several concepts in several regularities that we have for Europe, more or less, in terms of inequalities, in terms of well-being, in terms of collective action. And we have a Nordic Europe, a Central Europe, a South and Eastern country, a South Europe and the Eastern countries. In terms of challenge in development theories and the science of well-being, we think that the new sociology of developing is going in the right direction, but it needs to incorporate deeply the concepts of well-being and successful societies. Very important, work and inequality structure are relevant in our opinion, and trust in our data are important for successful societies. And we need to go beyond individuals in the science of well-being, so considered collective well-being. Challenge in measuring progress, the needs of the meso level, and we think that collective action could be understood several ways with several indicators. We need this level, the meso level, to understand how to measure progress and how to go further in understand successful societies, and to go deepen in these relations that we think are very important. The relations between inequalities, well-being, collective action, and growth. Thank you. Sorry, we have here the reference, but it's not. Thank you.
I'm just curious to know how you measure collective action in your graphs.
Should I answer now? Okay, it is an indicator that was built on 7 questions in European Social Survey, and it's about if people do that action, that collective action practice, participate in manifestations, boycott some products, more citizenship practice, but this is only an indicator. I think there are several other indicators that are relevant for understanding collective action.
Is that an indicator that you created or that exists?
It's an indicator that was created from the European Social Survey.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you.
A very short question. What do the sociological development theories have to say about the causes of the loss of the collective dimension in modern societies?
Actually, I think the new sociology of developing is going to, it starts around 7-8 years, and the previous theoretical frameworks, I think they miss this perspective. But now the main the relations between institutions and collective action could be a fruitful way for sociology of development help these discussions. So mainly on that matter, how institutions and collective action could be related, and actually to understand collective action we need to understand institutions. So it is on this relation between these two concepts.
So I'm wondering if you can tell us just in a couple of words, when you say improve society, how you're conceptualizing an improvement of society, if you have that in a few words. And one thing, my well-being, and I gather kind of it's multidimensional, but then maybe you have some trade-offs. So if someone pursues positional consumption of one form or another, their well-being might improve, but it's zero-sum game at the society level.
Yeah, I think it is important to have this, to improve this concept of successful societies, and to understand how we need to have, in my understanding, we need to have a structural framework in terms of inequalities, several variables of inequalities. We need to understand very well what could be the collective action dimensions, and we could measure the success of societies by having some indicators. Probably when the colleague from UK was talking about national well-being, I think we could have that, and a national perspective, a way of conceptualizing and understand successful societies that could be conceptualized, but also by comparing countries in some indicators. And I think in our perspective, I could see more or less successful societies in some kinds of indicators, not only about economic indicators, but the Nordic countries are the countries with the highest trust, with lower inequality, with high levels of pollution, and so forth. So actually, I don't have a way to conceptualize successful societies, but I think it could be a good challenge for the future. Who knows? Actually, it's not my concept, of course. It's inspired in Michel Lamont and Peter Hall.